Goes off the left side, you know. I have a problem. The problem is the audience. And the problem with the audience is that there are some of you who are attending the first socialist conference of this type that you've ever gone to, and are new to the movement. Some have not even paid their dues, which is terrible. Leave here with that kind of a stain on your soul, we have failed utterly. But there are also some people here who have been in the movement for a long time, who have a wealth of experience in practical politics on campus, in the labor movement, in American politics as a whole, and also in terms of socialist theory. My job, a very difficult job, is to try to talk to an audience which is on several levels. Therefore, I apologize if at times I might seem abstruse and if at times I might seem simplistic. But it's built into the situation. Okay. What I want to do is to take two questions and deal with them naturally in three different ways. The two questions are, by the way, the reason for three is that God wants it that way. Very simple. I don't know why this is. He or she created the universe so as to be best explicated by triads. Okay. St. Augustine knew it even before Hegel. The two questions are the following questions. You'll hear them around. Question number one, addressed, let's say, to somebody at DSOC. Why don't you people talk about socialism? Why are you always paying all this attention to liberals? Why are you messing around in the Democratic Party? Why don't you plant a socialist banner, take the cotton out of your mouth, and come out for what you're for? That way people will respect you and they'll join you. That's one question. Other question, slightly different. Why, for God's name, you people keep calling yourselves socialists? Why don't you just take your excellent immediate program, put your socialism back in the closet, and be really effective in American society, and don't raise a word that creates more misunderstanding than it is? The first objection I would call an objection from a sectarian point of view. The second objection raises the question of the relationship of socialism to liberalism, which in the United States, of all the countries in the world, is a key question for socialists. In no other country do you have no mass socialist movement and a mass liberal movement. Therefore, the relationship of socialism to liberalism is a key relationship. So I want to explore those two questions, first of all, by trying to deal with that sectarian objective. Why don't you talk about socialism? Stop messing around with the Democratic Party and coalition. Be a socialist movement. Sectarianism. Secondly, I want to raise the question of the relationship of socialism to liberalism, which is a very complex relationship. I might summarize that relationship by saying socialists are not liberals, but socialists in America are part of the liberal community. That's not a simple relationship. I want to discuss it. And finally, I want to talk about how all of this relates to young people coming to the socialist movement, those who have arrived at socialism 5 years ago, and those who arrived yesterday. Okay. First of all, let me deal with the sectarian objection to coalitional politics. What is sectarianism? What are its characteristics? Now here, you may object that I am about to give a sectarian attack on sectarianism. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back in history and look at some comments that were made over 100 years ago in a document called the Communist Manifesto, and utilize that as the basis of my critique of sectarianism today. My defense as to why this is not a sectarian exercise is to say that there is a remarkable continuity in sectarianism. That, as you will see when I read you what was said over 100 years ago, it applies perfectly to people you'll meet on campus today. There are many other aspects of topics treated by Marx and Engels which have changed enormously, where it is precisely sectarianism to repeat the old form. This is not that kind of a case. So let me go back and develop a general theory of sectarianism before then coming to its applications in the United States today. Number one, there was a time when sects, socialist were extremely progressive. Sectarianism is not always bad. Sectarianism is positive at that point in history where there is no other expression of socialism which is historically possible. That is to say, prior to the time in which socialism could become a mass movement based first and foremost on working people, prior to that time, socialist sectarianism was a means of communicating truth and propagating an ideal. It was positive. One thinks back just to, let's say, the movements of after the year 1000, to movements like the movement led by St. Francis of Assisi. It was a radical movement. It was challenging wealth. It was challenging the hierarchy of the church. It contained within it, in religious theological form, many ideas which were later to become socialist ideas. Franciscanism, if you will, is part of the Marxist or the socialist heritage. One of the figures out of that positive sectarian history who fascinates me, more to the point who fascinated Ignacio Saloni, who died recently, was a man by the name of Joaquim de Flor, who developed a theory which reverberated throughout the Middle Ages in almost every radical movement. And that theory was that history was divided into the age of the Father, which was the age of Judaism, the age of law and authority, to be followed by the age of the Son, which was the age of Christianity and the Church, to be followed by the age of the Holy Ghost. And in the age of the Holy Ghost, there would no longer be churches. The Spirit would be so among people that you would not need institutional structures, you would not need laws or hierarchies. It was an anarchist vision, which caught the imagination of poor people throughout the Middle Ages, and was part of the very important sectarian history. Finally, the most rich example of a positive sectarianism was the literal the sects in the English Revolution. That is to say, in the English Revolution of the 17th century, social consciousness took theological form, class struggles were carried out theologically in terms of debates over how the church should be organized. And you had movements like you had the Puritans, the Presbyterians, the Episcopalians, the Anglicans, the High Church, and you had the radical left wing, the levelers and the diggers. You had one of the greatest sectarians in the history of humankind, the General Winstanley. You had Winstanley's vision, and it's a theme that in British radical history you encounter many, many times. It was a vision of creating in England Jerusalem. It was an idea of a holy city, of history curving around and at its end, creating a new Jerusalem. Okay. That sectarianism was positive, but with the beginning of the modern world, let's say, without splitting hairs about it, 17th, 18th century, with the French Revolution, with the first secular revolution, the first revolution which is argued in political rather than theological terms, which is dealt with in the level of ideas. With that revolution, the socialist possibility begins, and sectarianism, which at a certain point in history is positive, begins to become negative. But even then, you have a number of thinkers who are not sectarianism, they're sort of the bridge between sectarianism and the modern socialist movement. We call them utopian socialists, or at least one does in the Marxist tradition. And I'm talking, of course, about people like Owen, Saint-Simon, and Fourier. And what were their characteristics? They were socialist thinkers who had the enormous contribution to make to introduce the idea of socialism to the modern world. The word socialism comes from these people. That's where we get the word. The word does not appear anywhere until the 19th century. And one of the very interesting ways of studying history is to discover when certain words appear. Socialism appears as a word, as a self-conscious but not fully formed idea at the beginning of the 19th century in the writings of people like Owen and Saint-Simon and Fourier. Now, when Marx and Engels talk about it, They stress on the one hand their great positive contribution, but then they talk about their limitation. And what's their limitation? That these are people who see the socialist transformation not in the self-activity of working people and the majority, not as something to be conquered by socialist change, as being the activity of intellectuals who work out programs which they then persuade the entire society in all of its classes to adopt. Robert Owen believed in persuading not simply the workers, but persuading lords, ladies, the rich, the entire society of a socialist point of view. And by the way, got a hearing for a while until he let something out of, said something that he shouldn't have said. He admitted that he didn't believe in God. And at the beginning of the 19th century, it was all right to talk about socialism in polite society, not about atheism, and that was the end of that. And he was then forced to turn to the workers. And the workers took Owenism, which was a philanthropic doctrine, a doctrine in which Owen was going to save the workers from themselves. They reinterpreted Owenism in terms of their needs in a trade union movement, in terms of their needs in actual class struggles. So here you have the moment where the idea, the sectarian idea, is changed by reality itself, and it's changed by the activity of people struggling to change their own lives. More broadly, sectarianism is fundamentally an ahistorical phenomenon. Sectarians are people who do not notice the history that they are living in. Sectarians are people who try to apply universal formulae regardless of conditions. And although at the beginning of socialist history that's positive, as time goes on, it becomes less and less so, and finally it becomes terribly destructive. Here is Marx and Engels, writing in what the section of the Communist Manifesto that practically nobody reads, sometimes called the literary section of the Communist Manifesto. And here's what they say about the sectarians who come after a great thinker like a Saint-Simon or an Owen or a Fourier. They stick to the old views of the master as against the historical development of the proletariat. They counterpose themselves with great bitterness to the political movement of the workers, which can only emerge by not believing in the new gospel. That is to say, the sectarian has got what the workers should believe written down for him or her by someone. And when the workers don't believe what they should believe, the sectarian counterposes herself to the actual movement of the workers. And in that sense, sectarianism can go from being something which is wrong to being literally reactionary. Now, one of the most brilliant descriptions of that, again, is from the manifesto. It's Marx talking about a group that he calls the true socialists. And let me quote at length. The reason I quote at length is if you listen to this, think about people you meet on campus today, and I think you might recognize 140 years after the event, some people who were about at least 140 years old. Here is what Marx wrote, Marx and Engels wrote. The socialist and communist literature of France, which rose under the oppression of a ruling bourgeoisie, and is the literary expression of the struggle against that rule, was introduced into Germany at a time when the bourgeoisie had just begun its battle with feudal absolutism. You have these ideas, these socialist and communist ideas, which grow up organically in France out of a struggle between workers and the bourgeoisie, introduced into a Germany where that struggle has not even yet begun. Marx and Engels. German philosophers, half-philosophers, and bel esprits, pretty spirits, seized upon this literature, forgetting only that the immigration of those writings from France did not simultaneously bring the immigration of French social relations with it. The sectarianism takes the writings, abstracts them from their historic period, places them in a period which stands in no relationship to the conditions that brought forth those ideas. Now here Marx gets very specific, and you see how sectarianism can literally become reactionary. the struggle of the German, and particularly the Prussian bourgeoisie with the feudal forces and the absolute monarchy, with a word, the liberal movement, became serious. To the true socialists, this meant the opportunity to counterpose socialist demands to that political movement, to fling the traditional anathemas against liberalism, the representative state, bourgeois competition, bourgeois freedom of the press, bourgeois law, bourgeois freedom and equality. They told the masses that they had nothing to gain from that movement and everything to lose. This true socialism served German absolutism as a scarecrow against the rising bourgeoisie. Okay, so what Marx is saying, and Engels, and they are profoundly right, is here you had a political movement which was merely a liberal movement, only liberal. And the socialists, the true socialists, the sectarian socialists, counterposed themselves to this actual movement in the name of hypothetical ideas which they borrowed from a book written under other circumstances in a different society. And I suggest to you that that portrait of people who are ahistorical, who base themselves on a holy scripture, who are hostile to partial, immediate, incremental gains, and who are hostile to actual social movements, that is something that you will find on college campuses right now. A couple of more words about this. Let me give you the reductio ad absurdum of this, which goes back to when I was a socialist youth. I actually once was a socialist youth myself. And in that period, there was a socialist organization called the Socialist Youth League, the SYL, which was to unite with the Young People's Socialist League, the YPSL, to form the Young Socialist League. After our Unity Convention, we had 83 members in the United States of America. That was through fusing two organizations. We got up to 83. The Berkeley unit, we did not have chapters, we had units. This was serious stuff, business, you understand, Leninism and all that. The Berkeley unit of the SYL was confronted with a student government election. And in deciding not to support a candidate in the student government election at Berkeley, did so on the basis of Lenin's policy for the Bolsheviks against the Mensheviks in the elections for the Duma in 1906. That is to say, you have got this mystical history, which you can then apply to any situation, and in which you can be terribly irrelevant. Now, what has happened in this country is every revolution of the 20th century has a sect existing in the United States speaking in its name. Most notably the Russian and Chinese revolutions, but also the Cuban Revolution, and I once knew somebody who was a follower of Amadeo Bordiga, who was the leader of the left wing of Italian communism in 1920. There was a Bordigas movement in the United States. Carefully applying lessons that didn't work in Italy in the United States half a century later. And all of this could be, I mean, as my good friends know, I enjoy sectarianism. I think it's a lot of fun. I consider it, if you have nothing serious to do, a very pleasant pastime to read sectarian literature and follow the nuances. And, you know, it's not as serious as science fiction, but I guess it's somewhat analogous. But it's a problem for us, let me tell you. Let me give you an experience I had. There may be somebody here who was there. Experience I had last February, I think it was, at Ann Arbor. I was giving a talk on the Third World, on the struggle of the poor peoples of the planet for some minimal kind of justice. There was a terrific turnout of students for a talk on the Third World. Let's say 500, 600, 700 students, very good. I finished my talk. Tremendous response. We open up for questions. I managed to recognize every member of the Spartacist League in the state of Michigan, or perhaps the United States of America. Because they're really smart. And instead of in one place, they were all over, and I would say, "Thank God, that's over." And I would go, and I would get another member of the Spartacist League. The problem was, by the time the last question was asked, 3/4 of the audience had left. These were people who had not come for a discussion of what Trotsky said to Max Shachtman in 1938. but for a discussion of the third world. And I find a real problem that we at DSOC face and will continue to face on campus is sectarianism turns people off. By the way, if you think it's bad on campus, it is worse in the labor movement. Worse. I had the experience, and I've spoken about it on a number of occasions. I apologize to those of you whom I'm repeating part of what I'm about to say. I had the experience a couple of years ago of speaking out of Black Lake at the UAW Education Center in Black Lake, Michigan. And the regional director of the UAW would ask me to address a regional conference of about 200, 250 local union presidents, shop stewards, activists. Did so in part because he wanted to confront them with the fact that I was a socialist. It was all over the lot. Harrington's a socialist. It was a program for socialism, socialism, socialism. When I arrived, I was told that workers had gone to the regional director and protested against his inviting a socialist. And the reason was, I discovered later on, they identified socialists, but their idea of a socialist was of a middle class, elite college dropping into a factory telling the stupid workers that their no good union was no good and that they didn't know anything about anything and that they should totally change all of their policies. And this middle class would then often take off very quickly. And sometimes such people getting involved in wildcat strikes, which had a very bad effect on the position of the workers in a plant in the long run and in the short run, for that matter. Sectarianism in the labor movement is a real problem for us. And American workers not only suffer from the general American prejudice against socialism, some of the more sophisticated among them suffer from a prejudice which they get from sectarians. Of people who in the name of the proletariat look down on real workers and have no empathy with real workers. Okay, I think that my portrait is clear enough, but now let me, before I move on to liberalism, let me pose a warning to you. Because I have some friends who fell off the tightrope spectacularly by not being aware of this problem. If one says that the problem of sectarianism is that it is ahistoric, that the problem of sectarianism is that it isolates itself from and counterposes itself to the actual political movements of working people, or of minorities, or women, etc. That's the problem. The corollary is not, therefore, at all times to be a socialist, an intelligent socialist. All you have to do is to adapt to the existing movements of working people, or minorities, or women, etc. That doesn't follow. Because the unromantic fact of the matter is, working people are not always right. Minorities are not always right. If the progressive, the potentially progressive classes always had the right policy, we would have had socialism 50 years ago, or 100 years ago, and wouldn't have to come to this conference. Therefore, if one has to relate to actual mass movements, one cannot relate uncritically to those mass movements. One has to have a vision of where those movements should go and couch that vision in terms of people struggling in those movements, but not simply adapt to wherever the movement is at a given point in time. Example, in 1914, the mass socialist parties of Europe all supported World War I. They were wrong. The workers enthusiastically supported World War I. As the regiments marched through the streets, working people came out and flowers were put on the bayonets of workers who were going to shoot workers from other countries. And at that point in the German movement, there was at first a tiny minority, led by Rosa Luxemburg and Liebknecht, who in the name of what was truly in the interest of the working class, counterposed the policies of the mass of the workers at that time. But they did so historically and from within, not from without. They were not applying abstract formulae. And you can see that because there's an absolutely incredible moment in socialist history. In 1917, Liebknecht, who was a soldier on leave, goes down to the railroad station in Berlin. One man But he's Liebman. He's the son of one of the great organizers of the German socialist movement. He had been in Parliament. He was the first parliamentarian in the German socialist movement to vote against the war. He goes down to the square in front of the railroad station and simply begins as one individual to yell out slogans against the war. And that individual action, because he was articulating something that resonated among millions of people, among great masses of workers, was a tremendous spark to the emergence of a mass revolutionary anti-war movement. So I'm not saying that you simply adapt, but that to where a mass movement is, but that you, if you oppose from within. I said it, some friends of mine had fallen off the tightrope. These were friends of mine who in the 1960s came to support the war in Vietnam on the grounds that the AFL-CIO, the representative of the American workers, was for the war in Vietnam, that was the working class policy, and therefore a Marxist had to be in favor of American intervention in Vietnam out of loyalty to the workers. And just to state the proposition is, in a sense, to annihilate it, but it's something that one has to take care with. But by the way, and it's really a last point here, those of us who tried to build an anti-war movement which included working people, I think we're right. That is to say, we didn't simply say the entire labor movement was a bunch of hard hats and reactionaries who were pro-war. We went out and tried to work within the labor movement, with people in. As a matter of fact, the trade unionists in DSOC were almost an honor roll of those who were in the anti-war movement. With people in that anti-war movement, and in the labor movement who were anti-war. Okay, sectarianism, I'm saying, is this ahistorical approach to social reality which on the campus, in the unions, and in mass organizations can be very damaging to a serious socialist organization. One has to fight it, but one does not fight it simply by accepting where movements are. Here the problem is, as Mark said, reminded me of Irving's book, to integrate the near and the far. To integrate the near and the far. Not simply to be the apostle of the far vision, nor simply of the immediate struggle, but of the far vision in the immediate struggle. Okay, second point has to do with liberalism. If sectarianism is wrong, what about that objection that says, well, why don't you just become liberals? You're always working with liberals. What's the difference between you and liberals? Why do you have to drag this word socialism out of some kind of piety or posture into the discussion? Let me deal with this very complicated question in brief comments. Number one, American society is unique, as we all know, among all of the advanced industrial societies in the world, and its uniqueness derives from the fact that it is the only advanced industrial society without a mass socialist movement of workers. The only one. In the current issue of the newsletter, there's a brief article on the recent Canadian election. We saw the New Democratic Party, the Canadian affiliate of the Socialist International, significantly increase its vote. It's always been at around 15%, or it's been at 15% of the vote for some time now. It increased, scored some notable successes in the western part of Canada. In Canada, workers who in every aspect seem to be exactly like American workers, who belong to the UAW, who belong to the steel workers, who belong to the amalgamated clothing and textile workers. Those workers who work for the same companies that exist in the United States, who watch American television, who get the same general standard of living, they vote for a socialist party. I've often said, perhaps some of you have heard it, you can go to Detroit, you can stand in Detroit and look across the river into Ontario, and on this side of the river the workers are liberals, and on that side of the river the workers are socialists. That's a problem. We American socialists have a problem that no other socialist movement in the world has. There has only been one truly mass socialist movement speaking in its own name in American history. That was the Debsian Socialist Party. And there are debates about when it went down to two. Some say 1912, some 1916, some 1920. That's irrelevant here. It has certainly been dead and gone for over half a century. There was another movement more difficult to deal with, the Communist Party. During the Popular Front and World War II, recruited about 100,000 members and had enormous influence in some of the major industrial unions in the United States. However, it did so precisely when it was being the left wing of the Roosevelt coalition. It did not do so as a communist movement in the unions, let's say, speaking its own name. In other words, communists in the UAW did not say, I am the communist candidate. He said, I am the progressive candidate. So if you want to talk about a socialist movement speaking its own name, you have to go back to 1920, at the latest, for a mass socialist movement. Related to that, the welfare state in America came later than in any other advanced industrial society. Later. And it was a welfare state that had, as Richard Hofstadter put it some time ago, a social democratic tinge. That is to say, in the 1930s, Roosevelt, who was no socialist, who indeed in some ways was the most sophisticated anti-socialist this society has ever produced, Roosevelt talked a near-socialist rhetoric against the economic royalists on behalf of the one-third of the nation, etc. We had a welfare state that was created in conjunction with the emergence of industrial unionism in the mass production industries. Okay. Under these circumstances, in America, liberalism means something different than it means anywhere in the world. I will tell you, for example, and many of you have had much experience in Europe, you always have to explain when you use the word liberal to any European. Because if you use the word liberal in France, for example, you will be understood as talking about an Adam Smith advocate. That's what liberal means. And what our liberalism is called in Europe, social liberalism. We are the only country with a mass movement of social liberalism. Moreover, in America, liberalism is not simply an ideology. Part of the problem of socialists relating to liberalism is they see liberalism only in its middle-class ideological variant. But if you define liberalism broadly as a movement which seeks reforms but not fundamental transformation, then liberalism is the dominant ideology of the American working class. And I say that even though if you went out and asked American workers, are you liberals or not, I don't know what the result would be. I'm sure a very large number, perhaps the majority, would say, no, I'm not. But the liberalism I am talking about is not simply, so to speak, the ADA. It's also that mass movement, almost everybody in America, because of our peculiar history, who wants social change, is in that sense a liberal. But if this means that we have to, as socialists, be part of liberal movements, if as socialists we are part of the liberal community, if as socialists we see the growth of a mass socialist movement arising out of liberalism very broadly defined, that is to say, the emergence of a commitment to really fundamental change arising out of a movement committed to partial change. If that is the case, nevertheless, and now I get to the point of my hypothetical objection, socialism is not liberalism. It's part of the liberal community, but it's not liberalism. Why drag in the word socialist? Isn't it extraneous? Couldn't we just have the immediate program and forget about the ultimate vision? I think not. I think not for a series of theoretical and a series of very practical reasons. Let me state in a nutshell the key reason. And the key reason is this. So long as corporate power dominates investment, so long as private corporations with a profit-maximizing calculus, however sophisticated that calculus has now become, so long as private corporations dominate the economy, American economy is dominated by private corporations. Just so long will the political structure have to defer to private corporations. So long as you leave that system of power intact, corporations have an effective veto right after the election. So long as that happens, the people can speak at the ballot box, but then the president who is elected has to win the confidence of business. Therefore, one has to say to liberals that liberalism is inherently condemned to frustration, because its excellent ideals cannot be realized unless one is willing to attack systemic power, corporate power, private domination of the investment process. Now, does that mean, therefore, aren't I back at sectarianism? Does that mean one then says the liberals, look, you really can't get through unless you have socialism. So why bother with it? Not at all. Here, let me put on the table a very important idea. It's the idea of a transitional program. Historically, socialist movements used to have a series of immediate demands. Right for workers to organize, workmen's compensation, unemployment compensation, and the like. They also had an ultimate vision of a socialist society. Classlessness, total democracy, etc. And they usually had no connection between the immediate program and the ultimate vision. There was no transition. One of the dirtiest things history ever did to the Western European socialist movement after World War I was to give them power. Because they got into power, and they're running the society. They're no longer agitating on a street corner. They're no longer organizing a union. They're running Germany. They're running Britain. They're running Austria. And they suddenly realized that they didn't know. They'd been talking about socialism for 50, 75, or 100 years. They didn't know what it meant in real life. They had no transition. And what they did, in fact, was they said, we socialists, when we get to socialism, parentheses, whatever that is, will run society in a socialist way. But since we now have power in a capitalist society, we will run it in a capitalist way. And therefore you find, for example, in the 1920s, Harold Macmillan, later the Prime Minister of Great Britain and a member of the Tory party, was attacking the Labour Party from the left. Because the Labour Party said, you run a capitalist society on laissez-faire principles. And Macmillan, who was a smart pro-capitalist, was willing to make all kinds of welfare concessions in order to get full employment, buy off social conflict and the like. Therefore, with liberalism, the point is to have a critique of its basic inadequacy, but to present that critique in terms of where people are, to lead them from where they are to that larger vision of the need for fundamental structural change. It is to have a transitional program. That idea, by the way, was developed in some measure by Leon Trotsky. It's written some of the most interesting things on it. But in recent times, a French socialist who disagree with the views I'm about to make tonight, by the name of Andre Gors, is most identified with this concept. The idea is this: two kinds of reforms. There are reforms which improve the lives of the people, but don't change the system. And there are reforms which are reformist in the sense that they don't fundamentally transform the system, but are structural reforms in the sense that they do not simply improve the life of people in the system, but they begin to change. They move in the direction of changing the way things are done. Example, I am for increasing Social Security. We could increase Social Security by 50%, it would leave the American system untouched, right? I am also for, in the case of Chrysler, backing up the UAW demand that if the United States comes to the aid of Chrysler, which I believe it should do to save the job, to do so and receive in return 1/3 of the ownership of the Chrysler Corporation, which would be exercised, that 1/3, be exercised by elected workers, by consumers, environmentalists, and the like. Now the point is that when you phrase it that way, not some abstraction, but you incarnate a socialist proposition about beginning to change the character of ownership in a major American corporation in terms of an immediate problem. You have then formulated it in a way that is not going to drive members of the UAW away from it, but it is going to bring them toward it. Now, in this context, I'm about to make a plug, but I'm making a plug in a high theoretical, serious way. I believe that Democracy 76 and Democratic Agenda, that is to say the broad coalitional efforts organized by DSOC to operate in the Democratic Party primarily with liberals, efforts which did not have a specifically socialist program, I believe that these are exactly trying to carry out this notion of a transitional program. And I don't believe that it's something that socialists do with embarrassment, that it is something unsocialist for socialists to do. I think it is the most socialist thing in the world to work out transitional demands that speak to where people are, but pull them, begin to set them in motion to go beyond where they are. And for that reason, here comes the plug. As I'm sure almost all of you know, on November 16th and 17th, there is going to be a major Democratic Agenda conference in Washington. And I think that one of the things that is very important to happen there is to have this emerging socialist youth movement and the emerging non-socialist youth movement. The youth movement in both in its narrow sense, as I would define it, that part of it that I identify with, and the broader youth movement, there at that meeting, to relate to trade unionists and blacks and Hispanics and feminists and environmentalists and all the rest of the progressive constituency. That is not something non-socialist. That is, in my opinion, as socialist as you can possibly get. But does this then mean that we socialists in the liberal movement never say anything distinctively socialist? Well, no it doesn't. And what we say about it that is distinctively socialist is not simply that we are socialist. I believe that socialists operating in coalitions have a specifically system-changing strategy to pursue. Let me give you a couple of examples. In the new Democratic Agenda program, something called social control of investment, the democratization of economic decisions, going beyond the New Deal. One of the slogans in the new Democratic Agenda statement is, the alternatives are, they want to take us back to Herbert Hoover. The only alternative to being dragged back to Herbert Hoover is to go beyond Franklin Roosevelt. And we are coming up in that program with the notion of actually getting participation from below in economic decisions. Generalizing that point that is there in the case of pricing. What socialists do, and I'll get in a minute to the sort of the broad theoretical framework, is at every point to represent both the vision and the sense of self-activity of people as the fundamental propelling force for social change. Example. Here is one which is somewhat controversial in DSOC. Might even get into a debate over it. But I think it's very important. As I like to stress, any idiot can nationalize industry. Nationalization can be carried out by, and has been carried out by, fools, fascists, Stalinists, charlatans, corporate liberals, every kind of type. Transferring property from private to public ownership, changing the certificate of ownership, so to speak, is a snap. It takes very little intelligence to do it. One of the difficulties in the United States is precisely because we lack a socialist movement, precisely because we do not understand something that Europeans understand, which is that nationalized industries can be as bad as private industries, and often have been in Europe, as irresponsible, as anti-social. Precisely because we are not too often conscious of the fact that the Tennessee Valley Authority is one of the greatest sinners against the environment of Appalachia. In the United States, people think that if they say, let's nationalize it, they're saying something truly radical. And I think with socialists in this movement, where now nationalization is being posed by the AFL-CIO Executive Council, by various unions, it's being posed in a sense in a much more, I think, progressive way by Fraser in his idea of actual worker participation and public participation on the board of directors of President. But now that the idea of nationalization is around, our specifically socialist job is to, in my opinion, to explain the difference between nationalization and socialization. The difference between top-down changes in ownership and bottom-up changes in ownership. And therefore, in that liberal movement, in these coalitions which are not socialist, I think that there is an immediate sense in which our socialism shapes the way in which we advocate coalitional policy. Moreover, what we have to say to the liberals, it seems, is until you are ready to deal with these fundamental systemic concentrations of power, you will not even be able to achieve your liberalism. But now let me complicate, as a final point in this part of the analysis, complicate my own life for myself by saying something that goes a little bit against that grain. I do not believe that you can visualize socialism as something that comes about through an endless series of transitional programs. So that finally, after the 33rd statement of the Democratic agenda in the year 2000, lo and behold, it will say, by the way, this is socialism. That's not it. That transition is necessary in this society now. And I want to raise a problem that, believe me, is not immediate, would that it were. But at least we have to theoretically recognize the problem. At some point, social structure has to change radically and fundamentally. That doesn't mean that there's going to be a day, a week, or a year in which that happens. But at some point, we're not simply for nibbling away piece by piece. At some point, the dominant economic decisions in society have to be democratized. And if the word revolution, I think, just suggests too many negative and wrong connotations to be of any particular use in American society, leave that word aside. In some contexts it would be fair to apply. But one is talking about a truly basic transformation. One is talking about, as I sometimes put it, not a new deal, but a new deck. One is talking about changing the fundamental rules of power, the systemic organization of power in American society. And if one proceeds toward that goal by way of a transitional program which states the far in the terms of the near and the near in terms of the far as best can be done in a given historic situation, one never loses sight of the fact that the ultimate necessity is a radical necessity. Okay, final point. How does all this relate to you? How does it relate to a socialist commitment? I think it relates, I get a difficult job. On the one hand, you are denied the solace of messianism. That is, it's terrific to believe in apocalypse. You can say, well, there may be only 10 of us now, but history is moving on our side, and on a day, bang, there we will be, and history will turn towards us. This is the deep conviction of every sect, that the central committee of the sect, the 10 people around the table, are the nucleus of the organization of the world of the future. And I don't think anybody can seriously hold that. Our movement, one of the things that we've always done in DSOC, I think is part of a generally admirable candor that we've had, we called ourselves by the unromantic name of an organizing committee. We did not say we are the American socialist movement or we are the future socialist leadership of America. We said we're trying to bring socialism from nothing to something. We're at a beginning. So I think in terms of commitment, the job you have, or the task is extremely difficult. It is to be both visionary and practical, at near and far, to hold them together. It is also important to realize that when one talks about a socialist transformation, one is talking about an entire historic period. One is not talking about this battle or that battle. One is talking about changing human motivation. One is talking about changing the way people relate to one another, not just an economic plan, not just some technique, but to actually change the way human beings interact with one another. That's not done in a day, a week, a decade. That is the work of a long, long historic period. But if one is conscious of that, I think one also has to be conscious of where you begin right now to raise demands that get to that more distant transformation. Example, I believe that in any transition to socialism, I wrote an article about this in Dissent, in any transition to socialism, in the first phase, you will have to have inequality of incomes. You will have to have income in part based on performance. That you would have to have, in a first period of transition, people who produce more paid more. Not Thomas Murphy getting $1 million for running General Motors. That's obscene. Differentials, nothing like the outrageous differentials that are tolerated in this country. But it is clear that you cannot go in one gigantic leap from a society totally permeated by capitalist values to a society totally permeated by socialist values. That transition inside our heads, inside our fingertips, inside our feelings, is something that goes on for an enormous protracted time. As I sometimes say, I guarantee you we'll all be dead before it's achieved, if it's achieved. But there are things that one has to address right here and now. For example, one of the principles of socialism, if you understand when I say communism with a small c, not the totalitarianism which calls itself communism, but communism with a small c, as my good friend Marx wrote about it in the Critique of the Gauche. Now, one of the fundamental things about that ideal is for goods to be free, or the necessities of life to be free, so that nobody shall ever be deprived anywhere in the world of what they need to live for a lack of money, because the necessities will not cost money anymore. The necessities will be publicly paid for, collectively paid for, and will be distributed on a basis not of ability to pay, but on the basis of need. That's the ideal for an entire society, for a world. Here and now, that tremendous ideal becomes relevant to the debate over national health care. Because, and by the way, we will not get a chance to put the ideal into it, but to get as much of the ideal as possible, to take health as far as possible out of the marketplace, to put health on an ethical basis, on a human basis, on a basis only of need. So what I'm saying is that there is this entire period, your lifetime, which I don't think much of this will be unrealized. And so what I'm saying to you, I've used one of my books, I borrowed not from Marx but from Pascal. You may remember from the Pensées, Pascal talks about the necessity of making a wager on God. Pascal said, it is impossible really to prove the existence of God. One makes an existential wager commitment without, you can never be absolutely rationally convinced that God exists, but you believe in God anyway. I would argue, somewhat analogously, that there's no way to prove that socialism is going to come. That it is not guaranteed to come. It is guaranteed that during your lives you will be, particularly in this American society, with all of the particular difficulties that imposes upon socialism, you'll be struggling with a very recalcitrant material. But you have to wager your life, it seems. And I think to do that, that's fine to say, to preach, you should wager your life. You have to, if not be convinced that you have proved that socialism is guaranteed to come, you have to be very serious about it. That's why one of the things I would say to young people who are becoming socialists is theory, reading, understanding, perceiving is as important as action, because only if you are able to ground your actions in a real perception and understanding of the world will you be able to sustain them over a lifetime. One of the limitations of the period of the 60s, and I agree with Mark, it was good and bad in so many ways. But I remember particularly in 1970, Cambodia, Kent State, the Jackson State, from every college in the United States was shut down, nationwide student strike, people out in the quadrangles vowing that they would be in the struggle against the imperial beast for the rest of their lives. 3 months later, you couldn't find 20 people to ring doors for anti-war campaigns. To be serious about social change requires that you really have thought about values, that you have somehow integrated them into a point of view that will last you for a lifetime. Let me conclude on a theme which I've stated a number of times in DSOC. And that's this. DSOC is not, in the old parlance, a cadre organization. That is to say, we will take anybody into DSOC who will give us the dough and sign their name. That is and we have people, by the way, who do nothing more than that. Who simply pay us a couple of bucks, sign their name, say, yes, I'm a socialist, I want to be with you, put me down, and that's it. But we cannot really build the movement that we desperately need among youth or among any of the other constituencies on the basis of such people. And if as an organization, I think we have to be an extremely open, pluralistic, tolerant, self-doubting, self-critical organization. And it's one of our glories that we sometimes really approach that idea. We also need people within the organization who are giving us not just 20 bucks and their lives. And to conclude, what I want to say is that would tell you, young people thinking about these things, that if you decide to join the struggle for your life, it will not only be good for society and good for humanity. It will not only be extremely difficult and frustrating, it will be enormously enriching for you. And therefore, I hope out there in this audience there are not just people who want to give us 5, 10, 15, or 20 bucks. I hope that there are some of you who will consider giving us more money.
I'm going to respond. I had a considerable say yesterday in a formal sense, so let me just respond to some ideas. First of all, let me start on sectarianism. I should tell you something about Khrushchev since we're taking people out of our closet. I'll tell you some of his anti-sectarian past. In the late 50s, there was an organizer at the University of California, Berkeley, by the name of Khrushchev Tyson, who got the absolute screwball idea to take student government politics seriously, and organized a student political party called Slate, which, if you know anything about the history of the 1960s, was one of the key developments because it was Slate that energized a group of people at Ann Arbor, including Tom Hayden, Al Haber, and a pile of other people, and from that action which Khrushchev started, really came so much. I should also tell you, I was on the Berkeley campus the day that Slate was organized, and I thought it would never work. Okay. However, let me just say one word, and the sectarian question is complicated. Maybe I simplified it a bit. One of the reasons why I was a sectarian in the 1950s, there was nothing else for a socialist to do. I became a socialist at the depths of the Joe McCarthy period. It was enough to get the FBI off your back. And what we mainly did is sat around and discussed history, ideas, and theories, since there was no praxis to be engaged in. But I would argue that the sectarianism was imposed upon us, even though in one of my fondest memories, and not the least because I was in my early 20s at the time. And I will tell you, later on, your early 20s will look good almost no matter what you're doing. I want to make another echo that I had. In 1962, the year of the Port Huron meeting, the Young People Socialist League, at the time of Port Huron, had about 4 times the number of people that Students for Democratic Society had. The Young People Socialist League at that time had built the largest student organization in 15 years. It's called the Student League Union. It was built around the issue of nuclear testing. It broke out of the traditional radical campuses on which the left had been confined since the late 1940s. It broke through in the Midwest to religious campuses. It was no longer New York, the West Coast, the traditions of sectarian radicalism. So the YPSL, Young People Socialist League, at that point seemed to have much more of a future. And at that point, for a series of reasons, the YPSL went into an orgy of sectarianism, in which it got more interested in the question of what Max Shachtman said to Leon Trotsky in 1938 than with regard to what was happening in the United States in 1962. And the result was, alas, that socialist movement had very little impact on the 60s. It self-destructed. And SDS had a major impact on the 60s. What I'm saying is it is complicated, but one has to watch out. And I would make more complex my comments on sectarianism, but I certainly would stick by it. Related to this, on the question of socialist demands, I don't think I disagree that much with Khrushchev. That is to say, I am certainly for saving, and I firmly believe that not only the public control of energy, if you define public as including cooperatives and community-based forms of ownership, as well as more national or international forms of ownership. I'm not only for the public control of energy, I'm for public control of all the major decisive means of production, and that's in terms of the traditional. And I'll get to that tradition in a second when I respond to some of Carrie's requests. But I think we have to say to the American people how difficult it is to get social property. that one of our functions as socialists is not to have a panacea. For example, many of you have heard me raise this point. I apologize for those for whom it's repetition. Supposing we nationalize the entire energy industry tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, where would we get a socialist cadre to run it in a socialist fashion? Where would we have the expertise? How would we make the decisions? Suddenly we would be running the energy industry. That's not simple. Therefore, although I'm completely for the goal of complete public, again I emphasize ground-up public control of decisive means of production in society, I want to say that we have to avoid some of the mistakes that TVA made, for example. TVA has been in cahoots with major corporations, not only in the strip mining of Appalachia, but in capital-intensive, non-employment generating industrial development in Tennessee Valley. We have to be aware of it. And I think we have to, so it's not, and when, I think, as I said yesterday, when the AFL-CIO Executive Council considers nationalization as a possibility, it thinks that is radical. And what I'm saying to them is that only, we're not against it, that's terrific if you're thinking in these terms, but it's only the first step. Finally, now let me skip that point. Let me get to a really key point that I referred to, which is that DSOC has been in a very difficult situation of trying to organize both a liberal movement, or as we call it, a democratic left movement, a broad coalition of socialists and non-socialists, and being the socialist left wing of that movement. One of the reasons that we have had to do this is because there has been a tremendous collapse of liberalism in the United States. An ideological, political collapse of liberalism. However, I want to suggest to you that our reaction to that collapse has to be very dialectical and complicated, and I risk in a very short few minutes confusing you, but let me try. Is it good that liberalism is in collapse? Yes and no. Insofar as that stems from the inadequacies of liberalism to deal with the crisis the society is going through, and specifically the fact that Keynesian liberalism in all of its forms, from Roosevelt to Johnson, no longer works, fine, I'm glad to see that coming out. But then I get a little more ambiguous about it. Do I think that the collapse of liberalism will immediately give rise to a mass socialist movement which will become a contender for national political power? To state that proposition is to show that it's preposterous. No. What is the next major mainstreams turn to the left in American society? Mainstream, presidential, senatorial, even congressional. I think it is a revived, much more left-wing and socialistic liberalism. But it's still going to be liberalism. It's not going to go, this country is not going to go from being the most backward country on the question of socialism to being the most forward country on the question of socialism. Now, I desperately hope that we can get out of the business of organizing, that we can become the left wing of a vital liberal movement. I would like to see that left-wing liberalism really get vital. I hope, James is here, I'm sure he will talk about this. I hope the Progressive Agenda, or Progressive Alliance, wow. So we'll see the dialectical unity that I was searching for in my previous I hope the Progressive Alliance really takes off so that they can do the work of organizing the center and we can be the left wing, at which point, by the way, I would be, if that took place, for dissolving Democratic agenda into Progressive Alliance. I think that'd be terrific. But I think that we have the problem that collapses it. What is going to replace it? And I think, as Debbie, this is again to Debbie's point, that we are in for some we're in for some difficult time. Okay, a couple of brief comments on some of the immediate political questions. With Ruth, I agree with Ruth's criticisms of Kennedy. And I want to reiterate something that I said yesterday, that I do not think Kennedy is the representative of the anti-corporate politics which is absolutely necessary for this society to solve its immediate crisis. But he is the candidate who will allow us to organize the anti-corporate movement on the largest and best basis. He does not represent our politics, but he represents the greatest possibility for our politics. And I think it is very dangerous to see only the one side or the other side of that equation. Simply to focus on the fact that he is not ours. Or simply to focus on the fact that He offers the possibility we have to hold the two together. Which again gets back to Debbie's point that for, I think, a period of growth, but a period in which we're going to have to be explaining some rather complicated ideas to the various people whom we talk. On the Citizens Party, I really spoke about that yesterday. Let me just reiterate again one basic point there. That although I think the social class analysis of American society has to be enormously refined, although I think that the existence of classes has been made, for example, incredibly more complex by the development of the welfare state. That you no longer have a simplistic class struggle. You never really did, but it is now much more complex than it ever was. That you now get struggles between independent truckers and farmers over the allocation of diesel oil. And where is a simple old equation of the workers against the boss in that kind of a struggle? Although I recognize that. Nevertheless, I feel at bottom, social class in the long run is the decisive force of American politics. And my problem with the Citizens Party is not that its ideas are with people, but that it has not shown evidence in those social classes and strata of classes which are crucial for mainstream national social change, the working class, the poor, the minority, and even the very extended middle class, new class, I don't care what formulation you want. It has not shown that kind of support. Therefore, I want to reach out to them. I want to talk with them. I want to be sympathetic. But I want to say, you've got to come bottom up. You can't go top down. And three ways to Harry's point. I'll really be quicker than that sounds like. Let me talk about theory, praxis, and theory. And then conclude. On theory, I agree with almost everything that Harry said in criticism of a rationalistic and technocratic socialism. I'm in complete agreement. My disagreement is in any way suggesting that that represents the central main socialist tradition historically. That it represents a socialist tradition is undeniable and tragic. There is no question that for millions and millions of people, perhaps at some points the majority of people who call themselves socialists. Socialism meant nationalizing the daylights out of everything. Centralizing everything. There was an absolutely uncritical belief in science, technology, the inevitability of history, all that kind of stuff. That was a socialist tradition. But it is not the socialist tradition. And I find, for example, in my readings of Marx, one of the things I find fascinating about Marx is that Marx shares with conservatives a critique of capitalist rationality. That the Marxist tradition, best understood, speaks in terms of organic development, of human interrelationship, of social relations. That the whole point of Das Kapital, if you will, if you can summarize 4 gigantic volumes in a sentence, is that what is decisive is not things but people. That what capital is not a technology, but a way of organizing technology and funding people as a consequence. And that the function of socialism is not to deal with things, but to deal with the social relationships which give things their content. Now, so on a theoretical level, I think that is part of our tradition. And I agree with Harry that we should constantly criticize that one side of socialism, but in the name of the fuller socialism, in fact, personally mine, in the Marxist tradition. More to the point. Practically, I find in the socialist movement around the world today recognition of that fact by mass socialist parties. That is to say, in part as a result of May 1968 and in part of other developments. For example, the French Socialist Party is now committed to something it calls socialisme autogestionnaire, self-controlled socialism. The Mitterrand Party, its program was radical in terms of decentralization, and I'm convinced they were serious about it. There was a book, I don't think it's translated, one of Mitterrand's economic advisors by the name of Jacques Attali, which was extraordinary in the degree to which they were really talking about. I mean, the French Socialist Party, in its election manifestos, talked about taking people out of commodity relations, getting back to neighborhoods, if you will. I find in Sweden, and by the way, I quite agree that Swedish socialism, despite our excellent relations with the Swedish Socialist Party, there's a lot to criticize. But I think one of the interesting developments, which is now occurring not only in Sweden, but also in Holland and in Denmark, is the notion of collective profit sharing, where the workers will get under direct worker control voting stock as a percentage of profits each year, and where worker representatives will come to be the dominant members of the board of directors of a corporation for 25 or 30 years. What I'm saying is I think that there is an understanding of this theoretical point and then to a conclusion. Theoretical point, I will now lay a super theoretical point on you, relates to Harrington. There is an untranslatable Hegelian word, which is found very deep in Marxism, which is very important, and it gets to the concept, and I wish I would not throw out such a complicated idea quickly, but I'll give it a try. The word is outhaven. And what outhaven means is that a progress is made, a change takes place, in which the old is not destroyed, but is taken up within the new and exists within the new in a transformed way. Hegel points out, for example, that one of the fascinating things about the development of human society is that some ideas that took geniuses to discover are now understood by children. That is to say, they have been taken up into the consciousness. Children can learn the zero concept rather easily. It took humankind an entire millennia to get to the zero concept. And yet now it took genius to get to the zero concept. Marx, for example, and this is forgotten by an awful lot of, quote, left-wing people, Marx argued that socialism would not simply be the destruction of the bourgeois system, but the taking up into socialism of all that the bourgeoisie had accomplished. That, for example, socialist democracy was not the negation of bourgeois democracy, but a radically new yet profound fulfillment of the promise of bourgeois democracy. And that socialists were not against bourgeois democracy, democratic, but against it because it was bourgeois. And that what socialists wanted to do was to take the democracy and give it a socialist content. And my point is, I think, in theoretical terms, I think we have the tools for understanding that these traditions have to be part of the socialist future. One last personal comment. I have always been a Marxist deviationist on the question of religion, although I'm personally a Catholic atheist. I believe that in a socialist society, religion will not, as Marx thought, disappear, quite likely flourish. Because it always seems to me that when people start dying from death, rather than from social injustice, there could be a little anxiety around it. When you die because you're born, rather than because there's no serum or because you're born a peasant in India or Bangladesh. Okay. Conclusion. Here I want to get back to Debbie. It's a very real problem. And I've had some experience in saying these things this summer at the Midwest Academy retreat at the state and local alternative policy meeting in Bryn Mawr. I think it's something that we in DSOC can say, recognizing all of the problems that Debbie talked about in terms of ourselves. I think it is conceivable in 1980 that there could be DSOCers doing different things in terms of what they're actually going to do in the vote. I hope not. It's certainly very conceivable. And I think what we have to say is to ourselves and to the people to whom we talk, that it may be that there's a miserable situation where the left cannot unite in 1980, but even so it has to unite for the 1980s. That we have to unite on a program, that we can agree on a program. And if we go differing ways within DSOC or within the Democratic left with regard to, let us say, whom one supports in the presidential campaign, we can agree on program, and we can agree that the day after the election or 2 minutes after we cast our vote, we start working on the 1980s. And what I'm saying is that I see a particular function for DSOC and DSOC youth in being in the broad Democratic left, those people who, in addition to having tactical opinions on which we may differ, unite on program and represent the call for unity of the Democratic left. Because the one thing we know is that if the Democratic left splinters in 1980, we all lose. And that we have to avoid, and I think there's a real role for us as the apostles of programmatic unity, even though there may be tactical